The Rage of Achilles is both the theme of Book 1 and of the Iliad as a whole. Achilles is a son of Peleus, a king in ancient Greece. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and leader of the federation of the ancient Greek tribes that have come to war with Troy, holds as his slave and concubine a girl named Chryseis.
I almost named my daughter that.
Yeah, it's a great name. Yeah. Chryseis, right?
I didn't, but go ahead.
She's a spoil of war, right? Her father, a priest of Apollo named Chryses, right, offers Agamemnon a priceless ransom for his daughter. Despite the Achaeans, which is another name for the ancient Greeks, petitioning Agamemnon to accept the offer, he does not. Thus, Apollo, moved by his priest's prayers, strikes the Achaean army with a plague, that is, his arrows, as Homer describes them, until Agamemnon finally agrees to return the daughter of the Apollo's priest and offers to the god a fitting sacrifice. However, Agamemnon finds it unfair that he, as high king, right, their chieftain, should have his prize taken from him while the lesser kings retain their women, their prizes from war. He then demands that the concubine of Achilles, a girl named Briseis,
That's how you pronounce it.
Briseis, pretty sure. We'll talk about pronunciations later, but
Sure.
Briseis.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really half confidence. I think you just
I agree. Totally agree.
you just jump into it.
Yeah.
Briseis be handed over to him. The contention between Agamemnon and Achilles provides the catalyst for the events at the beginning of the Iliad that will shape the entire narrative.
All right, welcome as we get into book 1. Check us out on the... Is it? Yes, it is the... I almost said A.
No, there's no A great books.
Yeah, it is
There's
the
great books. We got it.
It just like froze. Did you see me like my mind just went panic?
A good books somewhere.
Yeah.
We go somewhere.
Yes.
Okay. Go for it.
thegreatbookspodcast.com. That's where you want to go. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/thegreatbookspodcast. You can get a bunch of really cool free things to help you along the way as we go through all of the great books. Maybe we'll be doing this 20 years down the road. If I'm doing this 20 years down the road, I can't imagine what I'm actually going to be look like, what you're going to look like, where we're going to be.
We'll be here. We'll be talking about 20 years. We might make it to maybe like the Gospel of John.
Oh my goodness.
We're going to get there. It's going.
Okay.
We've got 6 months on the Iliad, and we're going to make it.
All right, yeah. So 6 months on the Iliad. So what's happening here at the very beginning? Like, let's set it up. We had the intro going in. Why does Homer just like open up into this like? Seems like just right in the middle of this dadgum story. I don't even understand. Like, there's no introduction. There's nothing to be able to understand. It's very Quentin Tarantino or something, like right in the middle.
Right. Yeah, it's a wonderful start. It's called in media res. So that's Latin. It's in the middle of the thing, right? In the middle. So he starts in the middle of a narrative. And so it's a little jarring, but it also captures your imagination, right? I mean, that's the point.
Right.
So he starts in the middle, and it opens up with just, particularly in the Fagel's translation, right? This wonderful opening line of just rage. Goddess, sing of Peleus' son Achilles, right? This rage, and so we get this as we mentioned, right? It opens up, and we kind of went. The opening gave us basically the first half of the narrative of book 1, right? It's a complicated narrative. It's going back and forth, and so basically Agamemnon has to give back his slave girl, right? His concubine, right? His prize from war, because she happens to be Chryseis, happens to be the daughter of one of Apollo's priests. So he has to give her back because Apollo's striking all of his men with plagues. And, his men, as we kind of find out,
Apollo being a god.
Yeah, Apollo's a god, right? He's one of the Greek gods. He's associated with the sun, with music, with archery, right? So hence the plague.
We even see him in book 2 be like the form of entertainment at the very end.
Correct. So then there's...
make book 3.
One of the books.
Yeah.
So he, so that hence his plague is contextualized as arrows, right? We'll see some archers pray to him as well, to hit their mark. So there's this contention right at the beginning, right? That's causing this rage inside of Achilles. And there's like these soft introductions to the characters. We're trying to figure out who they are. We have kind of a general notion that like these are the Greeks, the Achaeans, right? It's another name for the ancient Greeks. They've kind of come over in this like federation of groups. Agamemnon is their high king in a kind of loose sense. You can even talk about them kind of being chieftains, right? This is not one of the things that we have to stretch our imaginations on when we read Iliad is, and this was a joke when we got together in our small groups read the Iliad, right? We think of the movie Troy, right? Or we think of
oh man, I was gonna do the joke at the very beginning, where scene by scene where we go through Brad Pitt's Troy.
Right. So, but honestly, one of the things that Troy has in it that people sometimes don't even realize is incorrect is what these guys even look like, as far as they're not dressed in classical like Spartan Athenian armor. I mean, these guys are still kind of coming out of a tribal state, and they have horns on their helmet.
They look more like Vikings.
Yeah, when I read it the first time, because when I read the very first time, like I had this in my head, like, oh, okay, like these kind of Spartan warrior guys.
Or what we think of Vikings. It's funny, like what
Right.
we think of Vikings today is what they actually looked like. What the Athenians and stuff looked like actually.
Yeah, they had a lot more akin with that in certain ways, right? So
Right.
I remember reading it the first time, and these are the images I had in my head of this, like, the movie 300, this kind of like thing going on. And then they talk about like their bright armor with tassels and the horns on their helmet. And I'm like, wait, what is happening? So I think that one way to contextualize this is more of, this is a collection of tribes, right? From ancient Greece that's come over. Agamemnon is their high king, their, chieftain, their high chieftain, and he's upset now because now he's gotten to this bind. The girl that he picked happens to be the daughter of one of Apollo's priests.
Got to choose wisely, bro.
Yeah, he's made a mistake in his spoils of war, and now he has to give her back. And so this kind of sets this narrative. That's like the first half of book one that kind of sets the contrast, the foil that we're gonna have to get into. The in media res is really interesting, and Homer makes this famous, and then it's copied by...
Just to make sure we understand, in media res, can you define that again?
Yeah,
I knew you mentioned it, but like just...
in the middle of the thing, right?
Okay.
So he opens up, right? He doesn't open up like, once upon a time, there was this guy, and here's who he is, and here's this, he's from this kingdom, and then you kind of build this characters, and then once you understand the characters, then here's like the plot, here's the problem, whatever antagonism they have to unravel. It's just like he just starts with it. Here's rage, and here's two men that are just raging at each other, right? Mm-hmm. And we're sitting here trying to kind of pick up like what's going on. And in certain ways, this one is it can be. I know some people find it frustrating because they're like, wait, who are these people? Like, what am I doing? Like, what am I reading? And in other ways, it really, I think, can build some patience as you read Homer and can be really attentive to the text of when he reveals things and like when he doesn't. So, because it has actually a very different effect on us as moderns. So like Homer's audience is already going to be familiar with the story. Mm-hmm. They're going to be familiar with who these people are. They don't really need these introductions. We see in book 2, the kind of formal introductions do come, but they don't really need these at the beginning. Mm-hmm. However, we as moderns, like, we're kind of lost. So there's kind of two ways to approach the Iliad. One is that, you just go back and like you read like an introduction or someone tells you and someone just gives you all of the backstory, right? Because not only does he start in the middle of a narrative, but also if we can like recall like our introduction to Homer, like he didn't invent this story. He's taking all of these kind of threads from this oral tradition, if you will, that he's receiving, and he's weaving together what is now the Iliad. Mm-hmm. But at times, like the difficulty is sometimes he doesn't include backstories. Sometimes he won't tell us a backstory until like book 24, the very last one, right? So like for instance, like we have Hera, a god, we have a goddess, we have Athena, a goddess. They're, on the side of the Achaeans, right? They hate Troy. He doesn't actually tell us why they hate Troy until book 24. Mm-hmm. So there's two ways to go about this. Like one is we just sit here and I'm like, okay, here's all the backstories. Here's everything you need to know, X, Y, and Z, right? Edith Hamilton does this in her mythology book that we recommended, right? She just sets it right at the beginning and says, hey, by the way, here's the 10 stories you need to know before you get to the Iliad. So when you start, you know exactly what's happening, right? The other way, which is the way that I think we've elected to go, is that we don't do that. Because the problem is that I think if you come in with all these narratives, you become somewhat numb and desensitized to how Homer is expressing them in the text. So if he kind of alludes to something, like, well, I already know what that story is. And so you miss, like, why is he alluding it to it here, right? Or do I need to be looking for this? Or like some of the mystery he builds by people continuing to do things, but we still don't understand what their intention is.
Right.
So I think what we're going to do as we look at the Iliad is say, okay, when we kind of get to these parts, right, where there's like this backstory, there's these ancillary stories, like, is this something he develops later? If so, like, we'll have the patience to wait and say, okay, why? Like, he's building that suspense.
Right.
And we will see, can we be attentive readers and take a step back and be like, wait, I actually don't know why this character's doing this. Because it's easy to fall into a rut and not ask those questions, right?
Another reason why you should write in your book, right? As I've been going through, I actually ask questions in the margins, like, wait,
Right.
why did Zeus actually will this, or was this just fate? How did this work out? And then as I'm going and I actually get the answer later on, then I can go back and maybe in a different color pen or something like that, answer that question.
Right. And so it should I think it forces you to be slightly more attentive to the text on, like, okay, do I see this intent, or wait, why is this person doing this? And can I wait and see how Homer starts to, like, answer it? However, sometimes we're going to get to parts in the text, and we'll get to one here in book 1, that Homer never actually gives us the backstory. So, like, something's happening. We can tell there's tension, but he never tells us the backstory. If you've read the Iliad before, you're like, this story is literally not in this book. And if that happens, like, we're going to call it out. We're going to talk about it. We're going to give the backstory. So, like, we can all be on the same page about, like, what's going on. So Agamemnon has one, and we'll get into that. So the other thing I think he does that maybe just as, like, a preliminary challenge to us on him starting, like, in the middle of the thing, in media res, is, what does he actually invoke the Muses, which we'll have to ask, like, who those are, but what does he actually invoke the Muses to do? And I think this is something to really pay attention to. He doesn't actually invoke the Muses to tell us the story of the fall of Troy. He invokes the Muses to tell the story of the Rage of Achilles. And I think that should actually maybe challenge a few of our presumptions about what this book is actually about.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as we go, Achilles, as you will see, actually drops off in the story for a little while.
Right. So I think there's some challenges here about, like, who's actually the protagonist, right? Who's the hero? Are there, we come to this text, as moderns, we come very critically to texts and are always trying to show, like, we think we're smarter than everybody. We have iPhones, we can Google things, et cetera. Like, what does Homer have anything to teach us? Here, right, on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we're going to approach Homer as the teacher, right? I'm not the teacher, you're not the teacher, right? We're approaching Homer.
Just trying to figure it out.
Yeah, we're approaching Homer as a teacher, right? So, like, I would view, like, my role as just, like, a student that's already taken the class before, right? And so then I'm here to help, and I'm also here to learn.
Right.
So, we'll kind of get into, when he starts in media res, I think it's just going to challenge us to ask, like, okay, is this actually about the fall of Troy? Like, what are my presumptions here? Why does he invoke the Muses to tell us about the Rage of Achilles? Like, is that the actual thesis or not? So it's just a lot of things in Homer. We're not going to resolve the issue. We're going to flag them, and we're going to keep them as, like, something that we're tracking. Right.
Okay. Okay. So who are?
I was going to ask you that. That's what I was. No, I was going to ask you who the Muses are.
This is how the podcast works. I ask you all the hard questions, and then you ask me something about.
Good. Well, get ready, because I'm going to ask you how to pronounce some of these names here pretty quick.
Great.
Yeah.
Well,
so
it's be fun.
Okay, so let's talk about the Muses. Yeah, the Muses, I think, are just a beautiful tradition. I think they really are. So the Muses are daughters of Zeus, and there are 9 of them, right? 3 threes, and there are 9 of them. And in short, and they kind of develop over time, and they're assigned different things, and et cetera. But in short, the Muses are invoked, right, for inspiration. They inspire the poet, the bard, right, to bring to memory, to tell him, to literally speak through him this story, right? This story of these great deeds of their people here, the Iliad, right? Okay. So the Muses, right, are these goddesses, and they're going to inspire people. So you have just, like, a few of them, like in the guide, we really get deep into this, into, like, their names and et cetera. But for instance, like, you have a muse of history, of astronomy, of tragedy, of comedy, of dance, epic poetry, love poetry, songs to the gods, and lyric poetry. So there's these 9 muses, right? And so this actually comes, it's really interesting. This comes heavily into English of like the Muses and their influence on our language and what it means to invoke their inspiration. This is where, so if you look at etymology, right? Etymology being the study of words and their origins. Yeah. If you look at muse, you have to be amused, right? We find something amusing, or this is my amusement, right? I'm inspired. Music comes from this.
Museum.
Museum. That was one that I thought was fascinating, right? This is where we put all the things that people were inspired to make, right? So we're inspired by the Muses, and here's the thing where we put all the things that people have been inspired to make, right? So he gets this invocation of the Muses, and I think this is another thing to flag insofar as he does it right at the beginning, which makes sense. But at other points in the text, he's going to invoke the Muses, and if he does that, we need to stop and ask why. Why is this such an important part that he has to say, like Muses, right, to pray to them, say, please inspire me, right?
Okay.
This also, just for those, like, as we look at the great books and we're looking at the overall tradition, Homer sets everything up for other epic poems throughout the West. So, for instance, you're going to get with Virgil in the Aeneid, right? The Roman, it's a Roman epic poem. Like, it's basically a Roman version of the Odyssey. He's going to invoke the Muses at the beginning. Dante, when he has his Divine Comedy, right, in all three of those, he's going to invoke the Muses at the beginning. Even John Milton, right, in Paradise Lost, in that epic, he's going to invoke the Muses. So Homer, again, as we look to Homer as like the beginning of the great books in a lot of ways, he's setting a lot of things here that are now templates. If you write epic poetry, you invoke the Muses, right? And I think there's you can make a lot of comparisons here and spend a lot of time on, I think, the Holy Spirit as a perfection of the Muses,
sure,
right? That which amuses us, right? That which actually recalls this memory to us and allows to speak through us, right? So I think you have somewhat of a pagan foreshadowing here that's perfected by the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so book one, we open up with this rage, understanding that this is a book about Achilles, and then it talks about Zeus a little bit, and then it introduces King Agamemnon.
Right.
Immediately, as you kind of mentioned, that he didn't choose wisely, and that he chose a priest's daughter. But as we go through, maybe it's good to introduce Agamemnon, a key character in the Iliad. So who is King Agamemnon?
Yeah, so he is, as we know now, right? So we'll kind of track, just as like the preliminaries, right? I think we're going to, just like a few things we can say about him, like we mentioned, like he's basically the high king of this loose federation of Greek city-state tribes. He's a chieftain. He is the brother of Menelaus, who we'll be introduced to, who's the king of Sparta.
He goes by several different names in here that is a little confusing. We'll get to that.
Right. Sometimes characters will be called by their father's names, and so sometimes that you got to pay attention and make sure you're tracking who the same person is. So, but Agamemnon, so let's just look at a little bit of his character. So if you look at so we're book one. If you look around line 130 in your text. Okay. So here, Agamemnon is we should say less than happy that he has to give up Chryseis. Right, but he has if you read this, he has this line here that probably stood out to a lot of people, right? So he says at 130, he says, that glittering price for the young girl Chryseis. Indeed, I prefer her by far. The girl herself, I want her mine in my own house. I rank her higher than Clytemnestra, my wedded wife. She's nothing less in build or breeding, in mind or works of hand, but I'm willing to give her back, even if that's the best for all. What I really want is to keep my people safe, not seeing them dying, but fetch me another prize, and straight off too, else I alone of the Argives go without my honor. The Argives being here another name for the ancient Greeks. That would be a disgrace. You are all my witnesses. Look, my prize is snatched away. So... yeah. So good King Agamemnon.
Oh man.
He's, as we're kind of introduced to his character, right? So he's an interesting man to watch his rhetoric. So he's like, well,
what a servant leader he is.
Right. So he's just like, listen, guys, I like this slave girl more than my own wife, but I'll give her
standing right here too.
Right. And
brutal.
I'll give her up, but you then someone lesser than me, right? Because the high king can't be stripped of his prize while the lesser kings have theirs. But there's a side narrative here, so we just kind of warned about this, right? We call them ancillary stories, right? These marginal stories that Homer doesn't actually ever tell us about Agamemnon, and I think it's worth mentioning because the relationship between Agamemnon and his wife is something that will develop throughout the texts. So if you look at the Iliad and the
Probably isn't going to go well, based off of just that sentence.
Yeah, you can take a few takeaways from their relationship, right, about how this is going, and so it's a slow burn here, right? It's something that's going to simmer, but it's something that we should flag and say, okay, how does he talk about his wife? And
it's an ancient burn.
An ancient burn, yeah, very good, very good. And so this is the problem with the people listening to this who can't see the faces that I give you when you make puns and stuff. So anyway, they'll just miss out. But so one thing though I do want to is to parse out his character is take a little detour as a side story that tells us kind of who he is and what it's come, kind of like his character in coming to do this, right? Because Homer never tells us this, but I think it actually like plays into this. So when they were on their way to Troy, by the way, we don't even know yet why they're in Troy or why they've launched their war against Troy, right? So this is again that in media
res. All we know
res.
is there's tension between Achilles and Agamemnon.
Yeah, we supposedly there are Trojans and they're supposed to be fighting Troy, but right now we have all these internal strife. Right now. Correct. So they're on their way to Troy, and so they have this famous 1,000 fleet ship, if you will. And so basically the long story short is the Achaeans harbor, they anchor on this island. And one of the men, I mean, there's a lot of them, decides to kill a rabbit to eat, right, is my understanding. However, what he doesn't know is that the rabbit is sacred to Artemis, who is a goddess. She's the goddess of the hunt. She's associated with the moon. She's somewhat famous.
A hunter doesn't understand that the goddess of hunters think that rabbits are like the important one.
Well, it's kind of like her rabbit, right? So like it's kind of like you've trespassed on the king's deer here, except the king in this scenario is an incredibly brutal, vengeful goddess. Right? Okay, so she's kind of famous for this. She's always off in the woods and doing these things and etc. And it doesn't take a whole lot to make Artemis angry in her narratives. So here, when someone kills a rabbit, and basically she just changes the winds, and the fleet, this 1,000 fleet ship fleet, can't leave, and so they're just stuck there, right? Because I mean, think about the time period, right? These they have to go with the wind, exactly. Very good, like shocking, right? So they can't just pour the gasoline in, right? So they're stuck, they are stuck. So they have Calchas, he's their prophet, like they're always turning to him and say, hey, what's going on? So he discerns and he prophesies, this is what's happened, right? So someone did this, etc. And Artemis, obviously, a proportional thing here for the rabbit is that Artemis says, okay, well, I will forgive you, but you have to sacrifice the daughter of Agamemnon. So you have to have a human sacrifice. So you have to, Agamemnon's the high king, you have to go and do this. And this leads just to a brutal story. And so this is in our guide, but I want to read it to you because it is, I don't know, I found it moving. So the big problem here, right, is that his daughter's not with him, right? Obviously his daughter, she's not coming on the war fleet.
Right.
So where is she? Well, she's back home. So how does he get his daughter to come to the island, right? Because he's supposed to be off at war.
He's not going to tell her the truth.
Right. So, like, how does he do this? So what Agamemnon comes up with, and this kind of goes into his character, but also the character of, I think, the armies in general, the Achaeans, is that then he tells his daughter, like, hey, and his wife, right? So the wife has to release the daughter. So this is kind of what we're exploring, right? Is a relationship between him and his wife. Is he says, hey, I have arranged a marriage between, our daughter and Achilles. Okay. Now we don't quite know yet, but like Achilles, we know there's something big about him, right? The rage, but like I think it's safe to say at the moment, like one of the top warlords in Greece, right? He's one of the top guys, right? We can track that much so far. So this is a big deal. So she comes to the island
thinking she's going to get married to some war god.
Yeah, that she is here. She's made it. Like she's gonna be his bride. Like he's taking her as a bride.
Happily ever after.
Right. She comes ready, and so she basically shows up like in her wedding dress to the wedding, but the wedding is actually her sacrifice.
Man.
And so Edith Hamilton records the ancient authors, and they read, "In all her prayers, cries of Father, Father, her maiden life, these they held as nothing, the savage warriors battle mad." And so they kill her. They sacrifice her. And so then that's that.
Terrible
so then,
father.
yeah, so he's not the best. And so then Artemis says that's sufficient, and she changes the winds, and they go on to Troy. So just like it's a side, he never mentions this narrative. And this is one of the problems with these narratives too, just as like a caveat, not to like muddy the waters too much. But like Homer had a certain amount of like editorial like latitude when he decided what stories to include in the actual Iliad. And so we know of some of these stories because then later playwrights after Homer will include them in their narratives.
Right.
And then sometimes there's a lot of debate about how much is that narrative one that Homer didn't include, how much did it develop after him, like where did it come from, etc. But I think it's worth mentioning, particularly as the tradition looks back on Agamemnon and his relationship between his family, and also then what he was willing to do to take down Troy, right? What was he willing to do?
Willing to sacrifice his own daughter.
Right. So like, it just kind of goes in.
Lie to his wife, sacrifice his own daughter. I mean, then say like this, this war booty that I got is better than my own wife. Like,
Right.
What a stud of a man.
Yeah. So we're kind of going into here just a little bit of like, what is
that was facetious, by the way.
Right.
Obviously,
yeah, we got it. But like, who's the character? Like, what is the character of these individuals? Right. What's the character of the Achaeans? Like, are these the good guys? Are they the bad guys? Like, how are they being presented? And also, like, what is Homer trying to show us in these things? Right. So this is Agamemnon. This is the leader of the Achaeans. Right.
The first 10 lines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have this immediate opening of suffering, death of warriors, of dishonoring the fallen soldiers. And then right there it says, the will of Zeus. This is on what about probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, line 5 or 6. It says the will of Zeus was moving toward its end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sitting there thinking, like, man, all these bad things are happening. Is this actually Zeus willing all this suffering, or is this just a passive will, or is this an active will? I thought that was very interesting. I guess so. That's a good question to maybe piggyback on. Is like, so what is the role of the gods here in this book?
The Greek gods, I think one of the best ways to look at them is they are basically, they're immortal, right? Very powerful, but in almost all other ways are human. So like they're susceptible to all of the same terrible faults we are, and if anything, they actually exhibit them more than we do, right? So they're jealous, they're prone to envy, they can be deceived, they can be, tricked, they can, have bravado, they have their own vice and virtue.
So yeah, these peaks and valleys of character.
Yeah, and they can be very fickle as well, which is something the Iliad shows quite well actually. So these immortals, right? They live on Mount Olympus. The king of the gods is Zeus, right? He's the king of the gods, and we'll kind of have to play out his character some too. His wife is Hera. She makes an appearance.
White-haired.
White-armed, yeah, white-armed Hera for her epithet. And then we also get all this other host of gods that are coming out. So Hera's gonna be his wife. We're gonna figure out who Athena is, right? She's loosely associated. We could say right now maybe a working definition is like wisdom. She's also very much like on the Achaean side. So like what's happening with her. And so these gods, one way to look at them is they kind of personify certain attributes. So say Athena's gonna be wisdom. I think it pushes into some things about war that we can also look at. Ares is going to come up. He's going to be the god of war. Aphrodite is going to come up. She's going to be the goddess of love. Hera is, if I recall correctly, the goddess of mothers and expected mothers, childbirth, things like this. So,
Ironically, we'll talk about that later.
right. Somewhat ironically, given her temperaments and what she does. So they all have the little patronages, if we want to borrow that term, and they're all very much prone to fault. Zeus, then, it's kind of, I think we need to make some distinctions with Zeus.
Okay.
So Zeus, all the gods, just broadly speaking, all the gods could try and fight against Zeus, and he's still going to win.
He's that powerful.
Yeah, so he is like the king of the gods, and he rules through this power. And so one of the questions, and I think you raise it well, is not only who the gods, but like what is their role? Like what do they do? How they play in the Iliad? And you talked about the will of Zeus in the opening. So one of the things that we're gonna have to track is the relationship between the divine will of these gods and the human will and human action. And this kind of starts to form in the West a perennial question of what is the relationship and free will between the will of the gods, or say, in monotheism, God, and the will of man and his actions. Are we actually free? Do we actually have a free will? How do we do this? And the Iliad is great at bringing these questions up, because over and over again, we're going to see the gods are going to come down, they're going to reveal themselves, they're going to send people dreams, they're going to do all these different things. And one of the questions is going to be, okay, did the person really have a choice? Like, do the gods, like,
right.
are these
there
just
free will? Like, are they giving them free will? Or
like, are these all just
it?
like, empty, empty kind of puppets? Like, is it really just 100% the will of the gods? Do the humans have to be receptive to it?
Right.
Who can see the gods and who can't? So this is a question that we're going to track. I mean, this is a question that goes all the way up into and still continues in Christianity, right? Of what is the relationship between our free will and that of God? And so here we're seeing a pagan precursor to that as they try and figure out what's their relationship to Athena, Zeus, things like this. So, and also the other thing is they're bodily, right? So like they have to like come down, right? They have to come down and see what's going on. If Hera wants to stop something, she's like, get in the chariot, we're going, right? And she has to like go down. So they're very bodily. So
sometimes they're good at hiding themselves, their identity. Sometimes they're terrible at hiding their identity, depending on who sees them.
They're not, so they're not omniscient. They're not omnipresent. Zeus, I think, has some more of those attributes than others. But yeah, it's actually somewhat reminiscent if you look at if you paid attention to the first 10 or 11 books of Genesis. Like, this is actually how God is talked about in Genesis, right? So if you think about God has to walk in the garden, right? He has to be like, Adam, where are you?
Good point.
If you look at Tower of Babel is another one, right? God's like, I think something's going on down there, right? So then him and the angels have to come down and they see what's going on. So there's this kind of early stage of the divinities of are they bodily? Do they move in a place? How's this work? So Homer, as we kind of track these perennial questions, is going to ask us a lot of what is divine, right? What does it mean to be divine? What does it mean to be a god or a goddess, right? That's going to start branching and opening up some of these questions. And then what is the relationship between that divine will and the will of men, I think, is another one.
Yeah, I mean, as I read that beginning, I instantly thought, oh, well, Zeus is bad. He's an evil man. He's an evil god.
And you thought that because you attribute the negatives there to his will?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe that's just a misread on my part. But they're talking about these great fighter souls, and then how their bodies are desecrated to the feast of birds and dogs, and one thing we'll be tracking is just how important it is to bury the dead,
right?
And dead soldiers, and so that's the case, and it just seemed like, well, if that's the will of Zeus, then he's not a good god.
Yeah, and we're gonna have to look at. I think there's a question of Zeus's nature, right? Is he good? Is he bad? Are those proper categories for Zeus at all?
Again, I'm coming into this blind.
Which is good. And I think we're raising good questions. Other ones are: is there anything higher than Zeus?
Right.
Is
Zeus having is he being formed or conformed to a certain higher good? Or a higher will, again, is he passive or active in this will? Is fate higher than what is it already set?
Yeah, and I think that's the one that I think we're going to see, and the commentators differ on, is Zeus subject to fate? and we'll see that, right? Because the will of Zeus is moving towards its end.
Right.
And, how much of men's actions are fated. And so, but is Zeus himself also subject to a fate? And we're going to see some narratives here that call into question of like, wait, is he doing what he wants to, or is there something that he's like following? The other thing I would note too, for anyone who's like read the Greek plays, or if, hopefully, we're going to read them as well as we kind of move through the great books. And you also see this with like Shakespeare, right? You see these personalities that are just obsessive, right? It's like, okay, at any time you could have made a rational choice to stop this cascading thing of terrible choices, and you have not, and now it's all ending up in a tragedy, right? A lot of that stereotypes begins here in the Iliad. So you're going to have people like Agamemnon who will not bend, right?
Yeah, and you're just like, dude, just give it up.
Right. You're going to see, how Achilles responds. You're going to see how the gods respond. These kind of deeply obsessive personalities, and this becomes a stereotype, not like in a negative way, but it's a type, if you will, throughout the West in our literature and it's usually always in tragedies, right? And they're just going to drill themselves down into a hole until then whatever the terrible thing is happens. Right.
Sure.
So these gods and these characters end up being kind of a foreshadowing of that's going to happen in the West.
Okay, so Agamemnon is reluctantly giving up his prize, but then he says something like, well, I got to have something else. If you're going to take this away from me, I still have to be given something. I'm not going to let my soldiers, the people underneath me, have this the spoils of war, and then I go empty-handed.
Right. Yeah. So let's look at. So when we open the podcast, usually we're always going to open with a summary narrative of the entire book.
Right.
Right. Just so if you read it, you're like, I want to make sure I tracked well. If you've got a million things going on, you're like, I can't read the book right now, but I want to, follow along. That's great. Like we're going to have these narrative summaries at the beginning.
Right.
Book one is complicated enough that we basically did half. Right. So now we need to pick up kind of like where we left off. Mm-hmm. So if you look around, let's look around line 210.
Okay.
Okay. So this is where, so Agamemnon has to decide then what, whose prize does he take, right? So he's lost Chryseis, and now it's like, what prize do I take? Well, the person who was trying to convince him that he needs to just go ahead and do what he needs to do and return the girl to the gods, one of those is Achilles, right? One of the Greek warlords that's there too. And so Agamemnon turns around, and so a little bit above 210, right? He's talking to Achilles, and he says, I hate you most of all the warlords, loved by the gods, always dear to your heart, strife, yes, and battles, the bloody grind of war. What if you are a great soldier? That's just a gift of God. Go home with your ships and comrades, lord it over your Myrmidons. You are nothing to me, you and your overweening anger. And so then when you skip down a few lines, what he does is he's going to take Briseis. Now, Briseis is the concubine that Achilles has. Right. So the High King doesn't have his prize.
Right.
He signs this unfitting. So he's going to take, Achilles' prize. So he says,
and the reason why he's saying like he hates him the most is because Achilles is threatening to leave. He's basically saying like, if you don't give her up, then I'm leaving.
Yeah, I mean he's calling out Agamemnon's pride here, right? And he's playing kind of a front role on this. And what we see there too, I think a preliminary question could be, is Agamemnon more worried about getting his prize back or whom he takes it from?
Right, that's a good question.
Right,
and it's very clear.
Right, so we have to, if we look down here, just above 220, he actually says he's going to take Briseis, and then he explains why. He says, so you can learn just how much greater I am than you, and next man up may shrink from matching words with me, from hoping to rival Agamemnon strength for strength. So basically, like, I am tired of you. I hate you more than any of the other Greek warlords, right? Here you are in my face again, challenging my authority, right? And I'm going to take your girl to teach you a lesson and to teach the entire army a lesson, right? So I'm greater than you. You need to realize that. And also, no one else is going to come up and speak to me the same way you just did because they don't want to have their stuff taken away, right? So this is his...
wielding his authority.
Yeah. So this is, again, we're kind of getting into Agamemnon's leadership style. Now, Achilles, we haven't had our formal introduction yet, but he is like probably the most. I mean, he is the most skilled warlord amongst the Greeks, and we'll kind of see why. But
even by Agamemnon's standards,
right? So we're talking about if we're just talking about sheer like martial prowess, right? Who could go on there and slaughter the most men? This is Achilles by far. And so what happens? Achilles is just going to kill him, right? He's just going to draw his sword, right? It says that, he has his sword swung at his hip, and, should he thrust through all the ranks and kill Agamemnon now? So again, how's this book open up?
Rage.
Sing of the rage. So he's just going to kill him. He's just going to kill his own king, and we're done. And the whole war of Troy probably just ends, and we're over, right?
We're not going to go 500 pages deep. We'll be
Right.
We'll be 84 pages in, and
we're done.
Yep.
Right? So here we get an interesting narrative that I think is worth mentioning, and it has a few layers that we should kind of dig through. So Athena comes, right, vaulting through the heavens, right, swept Athena. So we're down around like 230 because the white-armed goddess Hera sped her down. Athena and Hera are always going to be caring for the Achaeans, right? They want to make sure they thrive. You can't have this infighting. You certainly can't have Achilles slaughter their own high king. And so she comes down, and she has one of the themes with Athena, right, this goddess of wisdom, is the terrible blazing of those eyes. Her eyes are mentioned all the time. Her blazing eyes. She also characteristically has gray eyes, right, when they're not talked about being on fire. And I think this, the eyes, particularly as we go into the West, and particularly go into like the writings of Plato a couple centuries later, the eyes are deeply associated with the intellect. Right, so it's interesting, and we can always speculate.
That's a good point.
Where does this actually start? This kind of connection, this analog between the eyes and the intellect. But it is notable, I think, here that Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is also characterized very much by her eyes, and they're going to play a prominent part. She comes down with the terrible blazing eyes. We see a little after 240, like 241. Her gray eyes clear. The goddess Athena answered, "Down from the skies I come to check your rage, if only you will yield." She says that Hera has sent her. She ends that little paragraph after 250 saying, "You need to obey us both." And Achilles does, and he obeys.
Right. Yeah, he even says if a man obeys the gods, they're quick to hear his prayers.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know if this is the case or not, but when I first read that, I thought, well, is it because he actually wants to do the right thing, or is it because he's wanting to, put a little bit in his pocket to be able to spend later on with the gods, be able to get some credit for the gods?
Well, let's push into that. So what do you mean by would he do the right thing? How do the ancient Greeks even decide what is the right thing?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, right? Yeah.
I mean, if we had to do that, I think on some preliminaries, or at least even in the classical Greeks, right, we're going to be talking about virtue. We're talking about, like we mentioned, about when the Greek culture and the Hebrew culture came together, like they shared the same list of the natural virtues, right? Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. We'd talk about these virtues. It's something to watch and observe here that we take note of, that virtue language is very nascent in Homer. It's just kind of percolating in its beginning. And it's not entirely clear what is meant by virtue. So like one point we could look at is virtue in the Greek is arete, right? And the etymology of that word, again, the study of the word, where's it come from, is arguably, there's other theories, but there's arguably it's connected to Ares, the god of war. So virtue is like, so who's the most virtuous person? Well, Achilles. Why is he the most virtuous person? Because he can go slaughter all the other men, right? He has an excellence in combat, right? Is that what Homer means by virtue?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, actually, the question is answered just a couple lines on down. Like that was my first thought, right? And then at 262 or so, he basically says, but Achilles rounded on Agamemnon once again, lashing out at him, not relaxing his anger for a moment. So it's not like he actually, there's this like piety. It's just like he just obeys authority, and then all of a sudden he looks back from a deity to a human person again. All of a sudden the rage just engulfs him yet again.
Right. Yeah. There's not like post like Christ like Sermon on the Mount. We'd talk about like these I say you shall not murder, but if you hate your brother, right. you're, also guilty. And what we see is in the New Testament, this moving of morality, of virtue into your interior life, right? So it's not enough to just abstain from doing an evil. You actually have to take a good into your interior life as well, and to abstain from that, abstain from hatred. Yeah, these are, so some of the things, obviously we do not see that with Achilles.
Right.
And so part of this is, we could just sit here and be like, you idiots, like, we know so much more than you, et cetera.
Right.
I think a better way to read this is the beginning of the conversation on virtue. And that's what we need to track. This is the beginning of the conversation of what it means to be a virtuous man. And what we're going to see later in the text is that we have Achilles. We're going to have our example of sheer, like, martial prowess, sheer skill. We have that as Achilles, but he's going to be contrasted with someone that, from our point of view, is going to seem much more like what we would think is the virtuous character. And some of the questions are like, is Homer contrasting them on purpose? Is he as a teacher, is he trying to teach us something? So you bring up a good point of, we need to watch virtue. We need to watch what it means to be good and who gets praised and what this means. And also there's a distinction. Is there a distinction between, say, Agamemnon's view, Achilles' view, the Achaeans' view, and is Homer trying to teach us something? Because remember, he's taking a story that's already several centuries old,
right,
and telling it to a new audience, the audience of his day. And is he trying to teach them something about what their forefathers thought of virtue, right? I think these are good questions. Let's also look at, we talked a lot about earlier, one of the perennial questions that we need to kind of track is the relationship between the divine will and the human will. And here I think we saw a small but very key aspect of this. We're going to get lots of examples. But if you go back to like a little after 240, right, there's the gray eyes again. Athena, answers, down from the skies I came to check your rage, if only you will yield. He has to assent to her, right? So we'll get back to this, like, are the humans just like the playthings of the gods? Like, is there something here? They have to be receptive to it. So here, I think with Achilles, which, he is a slightly different example, and we'll see why in a minute. But he, at least one, recognizes Athena. He recognizes the divine will. He recognizes that he's being worked upon. And two, he does yield, and he's obedient to it. Right now, as you mentioned, like, it might be for simply like, I understand the gods are fickle, and I want to obey the gods, because if I don't obey the gods, they don't
hear
bless
my
me.
prayers.
Yeah, they don't hear my prayers. They don't bless me. But I think if we just extrapolate from that, what's the relationship between the divine and human? Here we see the divine moving on man, but man has to be receptive to it, right? He's not
even
forced.
if he's reluctant to it. Like, he would not. It even says he would not fight the orders of Athena. He's not going to. He doesn't want to do it, but he just knows, I have to do this. And then immediately, as soon as he sees it, Agamemnon, he's full of rage again.
Yeah, he just goes
like 3 lines down.
Yeah, he calls him on like 270. He calls him the king who devours his people, which is a wonderful phrase.
I mean, and it's accurate. He gave up his daughter.
That's true. So I mean, I think again we see that ancillary narrative kind of haunting behind this. Now, I don't think Achilles was like some poor sap that got suckered into, the dog. I don't think Achilles like didn't know what was happening. Right. When they sacrificed Agamemnon's daughter, but it was Agamemnon's choice. And unfortunately, too, it's not the last time that we'll see human sacrifice come out in the Iliad. Right. The other thing, too, just before we leave this section is, when we read a great text, we talked a little bit about like, making notes and having, I think, really the fortitude to just mark in your book, like, don't be afraid, mark in your book, track who's speaking, track major points, put asterisks here. And really what you're doing there is you're really tracking the literal, right? Like, what does the text just say? Am I tracking the different characters, things like this? The other one, though, every once in a while, the literal will give way to more of a allegorical reading, right? Are we seeing two things that come together, say Athena and Achilles, there's more than just a literal happening here. There's also a allegorical level in which we see that these two things, as we talk about allegory, stands as a type, right? They stand of two different types. So we said Athena, right? She represents wisdom, right? She stands as a type of wisdom. So when we see her act, we should also kind of think to ourselves, like, is this wisdom acting in this? And is that telling us something? And here, I think it's notable that Achilles, who very clearly symbolizes rage, right? We very clearly see that for Achilles to make the prudent choice, right, rage is tempered by wisdom. That's what we see in here, right? We see that rage is tempered by wisdom to produce a prudent choice.
Okay.
So I think we can kind of see this, and the gods kind of lend themselves to this because they stand for things. So we can always ask ourselves, like, okay, this god's doing this. Does this lead to some kind of, allegorical read, or even, just an analog, an analogy here that we're seeing play out? Which I don't think the Iliad is an allegorical text. Usually, what we mean by that, we mean like everything in this text, as all these different types, all are combined into one giant narrative. Right, and this one whole narrative is an analogy or an allegory for this whole other narrative. So think of like Narnia, right? Here is Aslan, the very clear Jesus resurrecting lion, right? And this is their path of holiness, and he's dying on the altar, and like that's very clearly an allegory, right? Like everything here is pointing to this thing, right?
Very easy to pin that.
As opposed to probably the most famous distinction to C.S. Lewis's Narnia is Tolkien. Tolkien doesn't write as an allegory. Lord of the Rings is not an allegory overall, right? The types aren't like set where they always resolve the same way, but he does have moments that are deeply analogical, right? That these two things serve as an analogy or an analog to something. So, for instance, if you recall Aragorn with Boromir when he's dying, like that scene very clearly denotes like a confession scene, right? Aragorn's playing like a Christ-like figure. But later on, like Aragorn doesn't, die on the table for our sins, right? So it's not an allegory. He doesn't keep that type throughout the entire narrative.
I see.
But as an allegory would. But a lot of times in the West, and we'll see this with Homer, is we see these analogies. Two things are interacting that also represent larger things. Here we see wisdom and rage.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Then we get old man Nestor.
Yeah, we like Nestor. So tell us a little bit about Nestor.
Yeah, so when I first read it, like this is the first introduction about 290s where he's introduced into the scene, and he is a man who is he's an old man, very clearly, but he also is very good. He's very prudent. He has wisdom. He's one that Agamemnon will go to and actually listen to pretty relatively well, even whenever he's not wanting to. We'll see this played throughout, but. He used to be a warrior, and he has a lot of experience. And so whenever he speaks, he's speaking from wisdom, he's speaking from experience, and he gives sound advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he plays that prudent role. I think he has kind of that primordial maxim that age equals wisdom.
Right, absolutely.
And
a father-like figure, almost.
Yeah. He's the oldest of the Achaean warlords, and he's also this really interesting link to a mythical past. So it's funny because we think of the Iliad being very mythical because like Athena just showed up, right? But even for them, they already have this notion, and he actually kind of gets into that right after that when he talks about Theseus and like he recalls an age when men were so much greater.
Yeah, he's talking. Yeah, that's
right?
exactly right.
So it's interesting that like even in the Iliad, which we think is like this is ancient history, the classical Greeks thought it was ancient history. The Greeks in the Iliad are talking about like, hey, men used to be much stronger. They used to be much better. Like our ancients were this mythical time, and Nestor plays like this bridge, right? He's old enough to remember that, and so typically Nestor will go on some very long monologues. Talking about how great things were back then, and by the way, all of you suck, and you need to get back in there and get back into the war, right? So he loves kind of throwing out these criticisms.
World War II grandpa-esque.
Yes, like he plays that role. It's like back in my day,
right?
So he's the uphill in the snow both ways, going to school kind of guy.
I like him though. Like it was the first character that Homer has introduced.
Really?
That I was like, hey, I like this guy. He was enjoyable. He built up his credibility. He does go on. He has these like really long monologues, right, where it's almost like a whole page or a page and a half of a monologue. But I think it's important that he does this, especially for the reader, for the first time being introduced to Nestor, because Homer is showing the credibility of who he is and his character.
Right. Yeah, and he's always ready with some wisdom. He is ready to give it, and he'll pop up, several times.
So I don't know what happens to Nestor, but I like him so far.
That's good. No, that's good. Okay, so then we get, the problem has to resolve, and so we get Odysseus. So he's another warlord. He's the king of Ithaca. He's on the Achaean side. So if we're kind of just looking for working reputations, summaries, he's known as being a tactician. He's known for being very, he has great rhetoric, right? He's kind of a mastermind.
Now, when I read this, you have Nestor, who's good at telling stories, good at, has this credibility. He's an orator, and then you see Odysseus, and they also talk about how he's a great rhetoric. Mm-hmm. To me, I thought Odysseus was more of a guy who could rally the troops and get emotions built up, not necessarily that he was a great orator, like storyteller. Mm-hmm. I thought Nestor was more of the storyteller type of guy. Odysseus is the guy that you want as you're rallying the troops about to go into battle. Is that a good understanding, or did I miss there?
No, I think it's a good. I mean, we're halfway through book one, so we're kind of looking for working principles, right? Like what are we looking for, and where can we start to kind of take something, but then we want to make sure that our insights are malleable as we work through the text.
Sure.
No, I think Nestor is the storyteller.
Okay.
I think absolutely. I think he's a storyteller. He's pulling from this age in the past. He's quick to give his wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. He wants to give this, and he's usually trying to call men back to doing what they probably should be doing.
Yeah, moderation.
Right? To a certain degree. I mean, he's, you have to, sometimes he motivates the people in interesting ways, which we'll, see that at times. Odysseus, he is someone to watch. Mm-hmm. He is someone whose character we need to kind of flag and watch. And the reason I say that is because, we have the Iliad. The sequel to the Iliad is the Odyssey. Mm-hmm. And the Odyssey, the main character, the protagonist, really without question, is Odysseus. And so what we're seeing here in the Iliad are these little foreshadowings of, because he's kind of a tertiary character. Like, he's not one of the main ones, et cetera, but he definitely plays a prominent role. And so do we see any insights into, like, his ethos? Like, who is he? Like, what is his character? Mm-hmm. And he has this great rhetoric. It's usually contextualized as his ability to convince people of things, right? So his ability, but not necessarily the storyteller, or if he does tell stories, then we're going to have to look for what their meaning is. And if he does tell a story, is he keeping everything in the story? Did he add something to the story? Like, et cetera. And this plays a major role in the Odyssey. But right now we're kind of tracking him, and he's very tactful. So he's given the charge here of taking Chryseis, and the sacrifice back to, Apollo's priest, which they do and is, successful. So if you look around like 4:10, we've got Achilles. And so, they've taken his woman, and they're going to, they've won the Apollo's priest, Chryseis. She's going back to her dad. And, now Briseis is being taken from Achilles. Mm-hmm. And so he does something here that I think really, starts to give a lot of structure to the text, right? And we should mention something, actually, that I think we actually skipped over, which we should mention, which I apologize for, is Achilles has this kind of, because it's going to mature, but he has this kind of gut reaction when he realizes what Agamemnon's going to do, right? So you mentioned that his rage post-Athena's intervention still carries on. Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at 280, he kind of yells out this phrase that has to take on a little bit more structure, but it's going to basically inform the entire poem. And he says, 281, "Someday, I swear, a yearning for Achilles will strike Achaea's sons and all your armies." Right? We're getting this thing where, for some reason, they're going to want Achilles, right? Like, something is going to happen. And so if you go then back over to around 4:10, he's back at his ship, and he's weeping, right? He's crying, and he cries to his mom. Right. So here's our warlord. However, his mom happens to be immortal, right? Yeah, she's like a sea nymph. Her name is Thetis. So she gets introduced around like 420. He's praying, the man disgraces me. Now, again, I don't think this is like a love story between Achilles and the woman that was taken from him, right? It's like, Briseis is not like, he's not saying, look, they took the love of my life, blah, 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 blah. I mean, they took his chattel, right? They took his like slave girl. And so notice that, right? I mean, he's talking about that I've been disgraced. That's what actually bothers him.
Right.
Right. So if we kind of keep the
it's more about honor. Although I will say, as I read this, him, praying to his mom, crying out for his mom, it's a much different side of the character than we've seen thus far.
Yeah.
You have all this rage and all this, to me, this is the moment where I realized, oh, he's human. This is the human side of him. He's like praying to his mom. He desires his mom's help. It's a very human thing.
Yeah. No, I think too. Yeah. Here comes rage, and now the next scene is he's crying by the boats, calling for his mom.
Right.
Right. But it's helpful when your mom happens to be an immortal goddess.
That is a plus.
It is a plus. So she's a sea nymph. Her name's Thetis. Her father is the old man of the sea, which is not. So a lot of people might be familiar with like Poseidon, who's like the sea god kind of par excellence. The old man of the sea is like the Mediterranean god, Nereus, 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 and so that's her father. And so she comes up. She's a sea nymph, and then so he kind of retells the story. These are always things to watch. I think this one's okay. One of the things, it help. You can tell for a bard why this would be helpful to have a character retell everything that just happened, right? Because you can have that memorized, and it gives you time to think about what's coming next. But also, Homer uses it tremendously at times of like, when the story is retold to another person who wasn't there, does that person embellish? Do they leave something out? Do they add something? Is that person being manipulated? So there's a problem here where sometimes your mind starts to become numb because you're like, I really don't want to read another 40 lines on what just happened. But you actually got to push through that and be like, wait, is he leaving something out? Or wait, he didn't he's like, oh, I was the first one. Was he really the first one to do this? Like, there are things then I would challenge, right, as we read retold narratives to make sure they're actually correct.
Okay.
So he's saying, Mom, I was the first one to urge them back. Like, I was telling him to honor the gods. The gods need to honor me. Go plead with Zeus, right? And she actually gives this little narrative where Thetis had actually rescued Zeus once when actually all the other Olympians had rebelled against him and tried to like chain him down. And she releases, this like sea monster basically to help Zeus. And so Zeus owes her one. Right. And they kind of, and so, she, he's talking to like 480 or so. And so basically what he's done here is he's praying for her. Like, so what is he asking? Because his prayer actually gives a lot of structure to the text. He's asking Thetis you need to go to Zeus. And what I want Zeus to do is basically to bless the Trojan army. I want the Trojans to come in here and slaughter my own countrymen all the way back to their ships. So keep this in mind, right? Like, all of the Achaeans are on the shores of Troy. And so they're fighting on these fields of Troy. So if Troy can come out of its city and push them all the way back to their ships, right, then the kind of offensive has reversed, right? And they're on the defensive. And they don't have a big city to fall back on. And so Achilles wants Thetis, I'll get there, to tell Zeus, like, allow them to be slaughtered, right? So that, remember, he talks about that yearning. So that yearning for Achilles would come out because he's not going to fight. He's done. He's going to go sit by his ships. He's going to take the Myrmidon, like, which is kind of his, like, little fighting group. They're usually contextualized as some elite fighting group. I mean, they're just the men that came from the polis that he was from, right? He's the leader of. And they're all just going to sit over here by their ships. And they're just going to watch as his countrymen is slaughtered until... right, the theory being that this will finally break the pride of Agamemnon, and Agamemnon will have to beg him to come back, right? So again, looking at...
this is what his desire is?
Yeah, like we're just, it's an interesting prayer. Please let my countrymen be slaughtered so the king can have a lesson of humility.
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting prayer, right? So he prays to his mom. She agrees to do this. We see Odysseus return Chryseis, right? This is around 510 to 530.
Well, hold on. Before we get there, so she agrees. Like she says, I'm going to go to Zeus and I'm going to ask him for this, and she basically tells him 6 things, and this is between 490 to 500. She tells him 6 things. She tells Achilles that he's doomed, that he will have a short life, that he will be heartbroken, but she will beg Zeus. She tells him not to fight, and then she says she has to wait till 12 days before she can ask.
Mm-hmm.
Because Zeus is gone. Isn't that right? Like Zeus is gone with the other gods, and so she can't.
Yeah, he's not at a
place where she can ask. So she tells him back 6 things, which I think are worth tracking.
No, I think that's good. No, that's a good. Yeah, I see the 12 days. That's a little bit above 510.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a vow. And so it's another vow that gives structure to the text, right? What is Thetis going to do? She's going to intercede for her son to Zeus. Mm-hmm. We see that Odysseus plays his role. He returns Chryseis to her father, right? This is around 520.
Right.
So they have this. The priest then intercedes to Apollo, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have this intercession of where, please pull the plague back, right, from the Achaeans, in which Apollo graciously agrees to. We get kind of a sacrifice feast. They go through this long thing in a sacrifice, which we can kind of talk about at a later point of the sacrifices and what that means.
They always eat together too, right? This is something that I think we should track. As far as it seems like they have prayer, then they have sacrifice, and then they have a meal together, and then there's entertainment, and it seems like that happens. Right. Those 4 things happen, and when it does, we should take note because something is trying to be told there.
Correct. So then we get the 12th dawn, right? So the days have come up. So then Thetis goes up to Zeus, right? She tells him, what is happening. The father down 610, right? The father sits there in silence, and then, she's saying, "Grant my prayer."
The suspense is building. Right, she's coming to him. He's not saying anything.
Right. And then, he actually responds, right? And his response is interesting. He says, "Disaster. You will drive me into war with Hera, right? She will provoke me, and she with her shrill abuse." Right, which is the relationship. The relationship between Zeus and Hera is a fun one as well.
Yeah.
So, but why would he do that? Because Hera, right? Obviously, what's playing out here. Hera is for the Achaeans. She's for Greeks. Mm-hmm. She wants Troy decimated. We're not actually sure why yet, but she is full bore for the Achaeans. Right, she's already interceded a few times to help them. And so, but Zeus go ahead and says, right, "I will bring it all to pass. Look, I will bow my head if that will satisfy you, that I remind you that among the immortal gods is the strongest, truest sign I can give. No word or work of mine, nothing can be revoked." And then it's really interesting because then after 630, so he decreed.
Kind of a lackluster commitment, huh?
Yeah. Well, then I just found this we talk about the divine will. And here we get this assent, right? So the divine will through Zeus says, yes, I will grant your petition. And what he does is he just gives her a nod. So that's the official, yes, I agree. Mm-hmm. But even his nod, right? What ends up happening? His craggy, dark brows and deathless locks came pouring down from the thunderhead of the great immortal king, and great shock waves spread throughout all Olympus.
Right, so everybody's going to know.
Yeah, the god, right, Zeus, his will, he has assented to something. Mm-hmm. And that causes physical shock waves to go out. Right? It's kind of this beautiful picture of the weight of the divine will. Because notice, and this is a big deal, as Zeus attested to himself, no word or work of mine, nothing can be revoked. So this is something that's really interesting, that all the other gods in Olympus are very fickle, and they can bounce all over the place. They're doing this tomorrow, they're doing this yesterday. I mean, they're all over the place.
Right.
Zeus's will cannot be revoked. So once he says, I'm doing X, that's what happens. Now, clearly, one of the things that's interesting, and Homer makes it interesting, is we really have to be careful and track, like, what exactly specifically did he assent to, right? And what are the other things? And so what's going to happen in the Iliad, this is why you got to keep track of these things, is this is going to start causing this web, right? So now we have an oath from Achilles. I'm not fighting. I'm not doing it until Agamemnon relents. Okay, so that's the oath. Thetis gave her promise, and that's pretty much been done, right? But she's going to come in a little later and continue to help, but she's done that. Now Zeus has said yes, which means according to, as you pointed this out at the beginning of book 1, like according to the will of Zeus now, the Achaeans are going to suffer, and the Trojans are going to come up and slaughter them up against their own ships, right? So for the sake of Thetis, for the sake of Achilles. This puts him at war with Hera because Hera is for the Achaeans. And she's
a bold move.
Right. Just going straight against your wife.
Yeah.
/ sister. So just going to throw that out there, right? So and again, like, so it's really funny. Like, Hera can't fight him, but Hera plays this role of like the nagging, suspicious
shrill wife.
Yeah, right. So like Hera knows something's happened. She saw Thetis. Like, there's the shock waves, right?
She already doesn't like her because there was a love affair there.
With whom?
With Thetis, right?
For like Achilles?
No, yeah.
No.
With
whom?
Zeus and Thetis?
No.
Oh, I thought there was a love affair there.
Not for Achilles. If there's another one, I don't know about it.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm tracking wrong. Sorry.
No, you're fine. If it's Achilles, Achilles is interesting because he's one of the scenarios in which it's a mortal man and an immortal woman. So his father is Peleus, who was introduced at the beginning, right? Seeing of the Rage, Peleus' son Achilles, and it's their marriage actually plays deeply into the Iliad, but we're not told why for a long time. So actually, it's not even just like an affair. They actually get married, Peleus and Thetis. So Achilles' his mom and dad, his mom being an immortal, sea nymph, they actually get married, and their marriage is another ancillary story to the Iliad, and probably where if you keep pushing back to what caused the Trojan War, the marriage between those two is probably the scene that actually probably starts it all. But Homer holds this kind of in reserve, and here she is. She doesn't live with Peleus anymore. She lives back with her father. But they play this,
I guess I just made that assumption. Maybe that was just an assumption I made because it just seemed like Hera was very jealous. Like, she came back and she was very jealous that with Zeus and her being together.
Well, in Greek mythology, it actually is a really good assumption just to assume that everyone is Zeus's child and that Zeus has slept with everybody. That's actually, if that's like your baseline assumption, you'll get it right like 80% of the time.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So no, it's a good assumption to bring into things, is that Zeus has probably committed adultery and Hera's probably angry. Those are good. Those are good. So Hera finds these things out. We kind of get this snapshot into the relationship between Zeus and Hera, right? So all of a sudden, like, Zeus, she's nagging at him. She's saying, "What have you done?" Blah, blah, blah. Right. Down about maybe 675 or so, Zeus calls her the maddening one, right? You and your eternal suspicions, I can never escape you. So that's one side of it, right? Like, you literally are nagging me to death. Right. You annoy me. I mean, I have slept with, like, I don't know how many other people and, like, sired all these demigods everywhere, but
that's beside the point.
Right, beside the point.
Don't bring that in.
Like, as my sister wife, you're super annoying, right? But then that power aspect comes in, right? He says, but tell me, Hera, just what can you do about all this? Nothing. Right. Now, that's not then he actually talks about throttling her with his irresistible hands. So just, again, going back to marital insights here, it's not great. But there is something, though, to track here that Zeus is will, he's all powerful in this context. We want to talk about him like that. And his will cannot be revoked. However, so you're saying, well, what does Hera do? Like, why does she care? Why is she nagging? Why is she doing all these suspicions? Why the gameplay? Because Zeus can be tricked, right? His power is like a raw power, right? I'm more powerful than all of you, but it's not an omniscience, right? He doesn't know all things. And so he can be tricked. He can be distracted. He can be lied to. And if you lie to him and he promises you something, then you get that thing because he can't revoke his own word. See what I'm saying?
That makes sense.
So now so you say, well, why is Hera always like going around doing
Why
this?
she's doing that, right?
Because she can manipulate him.
Well, and it seems like he almost gets embarrassed. That's when he brings out, he resorts to this threatening violence. He like plays the game with her for a little bit, and then he gets backed into a corner, and he realizes he's kind of backed into a corner, and he gets embarrassed, and basically he appeals to his strength.
Right. So Hera, I mean, just as we kind of wrap up book one.
Yeah. And this is going to be a longer episode just because there's a lot going on that we have to explain in book one, right?
Correct. I think this is however long we've been going. I think, but book one is one. It's one of the more complicated ones, and two, like we need to get this right.
Right.
Because what we're doing,
let's build a solid foundation.
A solid foundation, right?
Not on sand.
Right.
I'm just throwing that out there.
You're great.
Yeah.
Because what we're doing is we're seeing a lot of the relations, promises, threads, vows, oaths that then are going to weave the Trojan War. Right. And we have to kind of track these things. If you kind of mess up who's on what side and what's the intent of and things like this, I think it's going to be difficult. So Hera, right? Again, we've said it's his that's Zeus's wife. It's also his sister. They're both they are both children of Kronos. So just like your little Greek mythology 101, because we're going to get a lot of things we talked about in the kind of preliminary episode on like who is Homer. We talked about some of the things about mythology and things like this. But Zeus has a father. His father is Kronos, which was a Titan. And Kronos' father was basically Uranus, which is basically the did you really just laugh at that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I just can't. Oh my God. How old are you?
I'm sorry.
I just can't.
I'm sorry.
We're going to have
I wasn't ready. I just wasn't ready, and it caught
We're going to have auditions for new co-hosts
yeah,
soon.
I understand.
So moving on. Anyway, so the very kind of one way to look at to simplify it, the beginning of Greek mythology is you have Gaia, which is the earth, right? I would say she's divine, and you have Uranus, which is like the heavens. So they come together and they produce the Titans. Okay. And these are like the first round of like the immortals. Kronos is the highest of these, right? Okay. Kronos then rebels and slaughters his own father. He dethrones his father off of the throne, and he becomes like the chief immortal, right? So then Kronos, however, then doesn't want his children to rebel against him. So when his wife, who's a Titan, and also I'm pretty sure a sister, has a child, then he eats them, right? And he just keeps doing this until they finally are able to trick him to eat a stone instead of his child, a son, and they take off the son to be trained and to be grown up and etc. And that son is Zeus. So then Zeus then comes back and wages war against his father, Kronos, and slaughters him, cutting him open and taking out all of Zeus's brothers and sisters out of Kronos.
They weren't digested.
No. So he saves them all. They're just hanging out in there. And he takes them out, and they overthrow the Titans. And so this is then properly, we speak about like the Olympian gods. They then make their home on Mount Olympus. Zeus is the highest. Like his brothers are also the highest, which you get Hades, god of the underworld, and Poseidon, god of the sea. And then from there, basically, they then populate, and you get a bunch of other gods, right? So some of them are the sons of Kronos, which are the more elder gods, and then you have the new ones, which are basically like children of Zeus. If Zeus has, or Thetis, any of these gods or goddesses has a child with a mortal, then they're demigods. They're like half god. So they're not immortal, right? They can die, but they usually have some great attributes. And we're going to see a lot of them actually in the text, right? Okay. Achilles would be one of them. Now that we've kind of seen his mother was actually a sea nymph, so like he also has this kind of divine patronage. So that's who Hera is. And then we also introduce at the end to Hephaestus, right here at the end of book one. Hephaestus is an interesting god. What do you know about him?
Well, he's the son of Hera, right?
He's the son. No.
No.
Oh. He does talk about his to bring his loving mother comfort. I don't think if I recall correctly, I do not think that his mom is actually Hera. I could be wrong. We could circle back
Zeus
on
is
that.
like trying now to bring his loving mother a little comfort, the white-armed goddess Hera.
Yeah, but I still don't think it's his actual mom.
Oh.
Because the thing that's interesting about Hephaestus is
So
that...
I know nothing because that's what I thought it was. I thought that's who he was.
Okay. We can double check, but the interesting thing about Hephaestus here is that he laments being thrown off of Olympus, right? Once by Zeus. So he tried to interfere like Zeus. He tried to interfere once between Zeus and Hera, right? And he got chunked off of Olympus. But he's also been chunked off before, which when he was born, right, Hera threw him off because my understanding is that he was not her son. He was another bastard sired by Zeus. And so she chunks him off of Olympus and he actually becomes crippled. So he's unique amongst the gods because he is actually a crippled god. He's the god of fire. He's the god of armory. He's the blacksmith god.
Ironically.
And like
being
what way?
crippled.
Yeah, and he creates like the weapons. He creates. Actually, it mentions here at the end that he creates like their houses. He also tends to be very good natured.
Yeah, I mean, he brings them back together, right? So, like, in this scene, the tension has, like, they're fighting, and he's trying to bring everybody calm down. Everybody get, let's all enjoy each other, each company. So he's the one that brings he toasts everybody. He actually brings back a smile in Hera.
Right.
And then Apollo is this is where it is.
It's right there.
Boom. Early in the episode, I was like in book 2, or book 3, but it's book 1. Apollo is entertaining everybody. And it ends happily ever after with Zeus and Hera sleeping together.
That makes it happily ever after.
Well, I mean that's why it seemed.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So overall, this is your first read through the Iliad. Like you finished book 1. Like what was like your raw takeaway? Like you were.
I was excited. Like I was pumped because there was a lot of things happening. I think that the style in which Homer writes. This media in res, like you were talking about in the other episode, it yields itself to wanting to keep reading because you don't understand, because he doesn't spoon feed you all the answers, right? He doesn't spoon feed you like this is this person, this is what they're struggling with. You're having to find it out yourself, right? And so I was enjoying it. I was a little confused on different names because this is new to me, right? But overall, I finished book 1. I was like, all right, let's roll. Let's get to book 2.
Good. Okay, so you get Ascend Great Books podcast bonus points.
What?
Yeah.
I didn't know there was such a thing.
You can cash those in for things. Okay, so no, you're correct. Well, listen to this. So this is from Edith Hamilton, which this is why we have her, because I think she's a good quick reference. So on Hephaestus, the god of fire, sometimes said to be the son of Zeus and Hera, and sometimes only of Hera alone, who bore him, this is where you get bonus points, who bore him in retaliation for Zeus's having brought forth Athena. So we haven't talked about this yet, but Athena, with her story, she's the goddess of wisdom, but she actually comes straight from Zeus. She actually comes cracking out of his head. He has a headache, and so finally they open up his head, and out comes Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So apparently Hera did not like that, even though there doesn't seem to be another person involved, but she still doesn't like it. Among the perfectly beautiful immortals, he only was ugly. He was lame as well. In one place in the Iliad, he says that his shameless mother, when he saw that he was born deformed, cast him out of heaven. So in that narrative, then he's deformed when he's born. In another place, he declares that Zeus did this, angry with him for trying to defend Hera. So one, he's chunked out as an infant. The other one, he's chunked out as an adult, or what he wouldn't talk about, right?
Nothing says retaliation to your husband than having a child with somebody else.
Well, nothing says retaliation to your husband as having a kid all by yourself with no one else involved.
And then chunking him down.
And then he's ugly.
Yeah.
And you chunk him off, and either he's born deformed or he becomes deformed, and then you gave birth to the only...
You really showed him.
She got him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So we're going to push our understanding of Hephaestus. Awesome. Okay. Anything else on book 1? Anything that we've missed? We still like reading the Iliad?
I'm sure we missed a lot, but we don't want this to be a 17-hour podcast on book 1. We want you guys to tune in next week as we look at book 2.
Yep. So we've
It's riveting.
It is. Hey, book 2. I'll give a defense of book 2. I will
All right.
give a defense of it. We've got the guide. There's more details there if you want to go read through the guide and look at the citations. Also, the guide almost has line by line citations. We talk about things like where you can find in the text. It can help you become a better reader. And yeah, we appreciate it.
You can follow us on Twitter.
Correct.
We post things on Twitter these days.
We do.
We don't have a MySpace page, but we do have Twitter. You can check us out. You weren't ready for that one.
No, I didn't. No.
Anyway, yeah, go check us out. You can go to thegreatbookspodcast.com. Thanks, Deacon. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Adam.